I think there's a few different examples of people who are whistleblowers who have brought forward information about how, for example, government agencies, intelligence agencies have overreach into our private information, this mass surveillance without a warrant, that actually violate our constitutional rights. These are things that a lot of us had no idea were happening until they were exposed. This gave us the opportunity, especially as members of Congress, to do something about it, to try to put those protections in place, to try to reform our laws that allowed for this abuse, many of which were opened up because of the Patriot Act. So, I think you're asking about Assange, but I think there are a number of other examples that need to be raised in how we provide protection for whistleblowers who are bringing forward this information that lawmakers and all of us need to be aware of in order to make that change.
Well, another example is Chelsea Manning, who just recently was jailed again. Do you think that Chelsea Manning is one of these whistleblowers who has been vindicated and that shouldn't be suffering anymore? I mean, I know President Obama gave her a pardon. What are your thoughts on her being jailed again?
Yeah, she shouldn't be. I mean, even though she got that pardon, they're putting her in jail for her refusal to cooperate. I think is further evidence for us to make sure that we have these protections in place so people are not wrongly incarcerated.
And similarly, the most famous whistleblower is probably Edward Snowden. And I know that he's a very controversial figure because he also showed how deeply everyone is being spied on. However, he's hiding in Russia to avoid prosecution. So just what's your stance on Edward Snowden?
Yeah, like I said, prosecution of whistleblowers who are bringing forward information about how the government is violating our constitutional rights need to have protections in place and not prosecuted and treated like criminals.
Julian Assange was arrested today for his alleged role in hacking classified U.S. military files. Assange spent the past 7 years, as you know, living in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, while American authorities are pushing to extradite him to the U.S. And I'm joined right now by U.S. Representative and 2020 presidential candidate Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii. Congresswoman, thank you for this. I wonder what your view is, because I don't know exactly what it is. What do you make of our effort to extradite and indict and punish probably Julian Assange?
I'm deeply concerned by what's happened today. We look back at the Obama administration's decision during his time not to do this, not to try to extradite Assange and charge him because of their concern about how this government action would impinge on freedom of the press. This is a blow to transparency and a blow to a free press when you have a situation where our government, is in a position where they can basically create this climate of fear against somebody or those who are publishing things that they don't like or saying things that they don't like. And that's the concern here. This is a threat to journalists, but it's also something that threatens every American, because the message that we are getting, that the American people are getting by what's happened here today is, be quiet, toe the line, otherwise there will be consequences.
So you served 2 tours of duty in the Middle East. You're currently a major in the Army National Guard. Assange, along with Chelsea Manning, spread classified information that prosecutors at Manning's trial claimed could have brought harm to U.S. service members in Iraq and Afghanistan. Do you agree with that? And what do you think about Assange's extradition and prosecution in the U.S.?
Look, over time, there hasn't been any proof that has been brought to bear. And what we have seen is that so much of the information that's been released has informed the American people about actions that were taking place that they should be aware of. It provided transparency around issues both related to civil liberties as well as actions that our military was taking in the Middle East that they should not have been. I think what's happening here is some form of retaliation coming from the government saying, hey, this is what happens when you release information that we don't want you to release. And I think that's why this is such a dangerous and slippery slope, not only for journalists, not only for those in the media, but also for every American.
So you don't think that he should have been extradited, and you don't support his prosecution in the U.S.?
I think the charges about hacking, look, those can and should be worked out in the court of law. My point is that I think there's a bigger issue at play here. There's a reason why the Obama administration chose not to extradite and prosecute Assange because they understood the danger. They understood the danger of the government coming in and controlling essentially what information is and is not being released. We can go back to the release of the Pentagon Papers as an example. We can look to how the American people have benefited from some of this information being released. So I think we've got to look at it within this larger context here and make sure that we understand what's at stake and actually the danger of what happens when we have people in government, whether it's this administration or a future administration, basically saying, hey, look, we can call WikiLeaks a foreign intelligence agency. We can designate an individual as a foreign asset or this or that, simply because they don't like the information that's being published or they don't like the things that you're saying.
So Julian Assange was just arrested. Now, some on MSNBC say that's a wonderful thing. Hillary Clinton earlier today said it was a wonderful thing. What's your take on it?
It's a dangerous thing. It sets a very dangerous precedent that threatens our free press and our free speech because it basically sends a message that if you're someone who is blowing the whistle or on things that are happening within our government that the American people need to know about that shouldn't be happening or that are unconstitutional, or if you're publishing information like that, then the government will come in and levy consequences. So basically, you've got to be quiet, stay in line, otherwise you'll see what happens. It creates this climate of fear that is very dangerous, yes, for journalists, for those who are putting out this information, but also for every American. This is not what our democracy is about.
So for Democrats like Hillary Clinton, is it personal for them? Are they letting their emotions about 2016 get in the way of what they should do in terms of protecting press freedom?
What I think is very telling is that over time we've seen with WikiLeaks how at certain times when WikiLeaks has put out information that Democrats have liked, they have appreciated that information is in the public, but we have to appreciate this transparency across the board and not be selective based on whether or not it benefits or hurts our own party's political interests. I think that's really the key here when we talk about free speech and we talk about a free press. We have to stand for that freedom, whether the information that's being put out is something that we agree with or not. That's really what's at the foundation of our country and this freedom that's so important to protect.
Now, Tulsi Gabbard is saying this knowing that there's going to be a strong contingent on the Democratic side that is going to hate her comments. And why are they going to hate her comments? Because all they can think about when it comes to Julian Assange is the 2016 election and DNC leaks helping Donald Trump and potentially getting him into the White House. So for sheer partisan reasons, you're going to have some Democrats who go, well, fuck Tulsi Gabbard for saying this stuff. You're going to defend Assange? He's a piece of shit. She didn't care. She said it anyway. Why did she say it? Because it's true what she's saying. And also, it's a matter of principle. It's a matter of principle. The principle of a free press is much more important than anybody's cheap political, partisan, shitty points.
What is your take on WikiLeaks and Julian Assange?
What happened with his arrest and all this stuff that just went down, I think poses a great threat to our freedom of the press and to our freedom of speech. If we look at what happened under the previous administration, under Obama, they were trying to find ways to go after Assange and WikiLeaks, but ultimately they chose not to seek to extradite him or charge him because they recognized what a slippery slope that begins when you have a government in a position to levy criminal charges and consequences against someone who's publishing information or saying things that the government doesn't want you to say. The government doesn't, sharing information the government doesn't want you to share. And so the fact that the Trump administration has chosen to ignore that fact, to ignore how important it is that we uphold our freedoms, freedom of the press and freedom of speech, and go after him, it has a very chilling effect on both journalists and publishers. And you can look to both those in the traditional media, but also those in new media, and also on every one of us as American. It was a kind of a warning call saying, look what happened to this guy. It could happen to you. It could happen to any one of us.
Edward Snowden.
Yeah.
What is your
similar situation? Similar situation. I don't think we, I remember the very day that I woke up in DC, looked at my phone, started looking through the headlines, and saw those headlines about how the NSA was mass surveilling all of us and collecting our phone records, collecting our cell phone records, and Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, and I was shocked. So that was something that Snowden uncovered and released, something that I don't know that even as members of Congress we would have been aware of. So now that we were aware of it, then hey, we can take action to close those loopholes, to change those policies, to protect our civil liberties, to protect our Fourth Amendment constitutional rights as Americans. But was the NSA going to disclose that information voluntarily on their own? Absolutely not.
What would you do about Julian Assange? What would you do about Edward Snowden?
As far as
what would you do once
dropping the charges?
If you're president of the world right now, what do you do?
Dropping the charges.
You drop the charges, but
people who are political junkies and who are outside of the rotten system in Washington, D.C., we look at this and we go, well, of course she's right. This is obvious, and props to her for stating the obvious. But you have to understand how powerful context is here, because she's coming from the context of being in Washington, D.C., surrounded by people who view this kind of stuff as taboo. Like, no, you cannot speak out in favor of Chelsea Manning or Julian Assange or Edward Snowden because, the NSA and the CIA and the deep state, have been crossed by these characters. The military has been crossed by Chelsea Manning. You can't side with them. That's like a slap in the face to the intelligence agencies and to the military. Tulsi doesn't give a fuck.
I've introduced legislation to stand up for and to protect brave whistleblowers who've come forward to expose illegal actions within our own government or egregious abuses of power, and to reform the Espionage Act to make sure that if a whistleblower is prosecuted under the Espionage Act, that they will have their fair day in court, something that is currently not allowable under the law as it stands today. So first, I introduced HRES 1162 with my colleague, Congressman Matt Gaetz, that very simply calls on our government to drop all charges against Edward Snowden for the actions that he took in the public interest to expose a mass government surveillance program on all Americans that violates our privacy and civil liberties and that courts deemed illegal more than once. I also introduced HRES 1175 with my colleague, Congressman Tom Massey, which calls for the same action, for the government to drop all charges against Julian Assange, who also acted in the public interest as he published information to expose lies and egregious abuses of power in our own government. Last but not least, I introduced a bill, HR 8452, to reform the Espionage Act. Now, Daniel Ellsberg was the first person prosecuted under the 1917 Espionage Act for his act of bravery in releasing the Pentagon Papers to the Washington Post to publish classified documents that exposed the lies that were being told to the American people about what was really happening in the Vietnam War. Now, Snowden, Assange, and others are being prosecuted under this same Espionage Act. But as Daniel Ellsberg knows well, under current law, none of them are allowed to speak to the intent of their actions in court. My bill changes that. I'm urging my colleagues in Congress to stand up for the American people, to stand up for our freedoms, and pass this critical legislation now.
This, again, is just like the issue we've been talking about, is one that doesn't get much attention on the mainstream media or even here in Washington, which is why I introduced this legislation. And for those who aren't familiar, House Resolution 1175 is a resolution that calls for charges against Julian Assange to be dropped, to drop the indictment that the United States government is currently pursuing for one very simple reason: our constitutional right to freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And the deafening silence that we hear from most politicians is dangerous, but it's also very telling that for whatever reason, they're choosing not to co-sponsor this resolution or the resolution I introduced to drop charges against Edward Snowden for the heroic action that he took. Why is it that Democrats and Republicans leadership are not taking a stand for freedom, and how dangerous it is when you only speak out and defend freedom when you feel like it is your own freedoms under attack, but are silent when it is someone else who is suffering or being impacted by it, being very short-sighted not to see that this may be impacting that person today, but it could be you tomorrow.
The increasingly authoritarian Biden-Garland administration is doubling down on its crusade against our constitutionally protected rights, our freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, by continuing their vindictive, retaliatory crusade against Julian Assange. Now, if they succeed in this, this will be yet another nail in the coffin of democracy here in our country and around the world.